So, my new camera arrived, and I was excited to try it. Green screen still doesn't look perfect, but it's a lot better, I think. What green screen? This is my home. This is my study. I also finally did a simple Google on noise suppression on OBS, and voila. My microphone is not picking up the fucking sound of the air conditioner and shit. But anyway, what are we going to read about? I'm going to do a little reading. Take a break from programming. Time. Opinion. Philosophy. Pleasure and pain. Poetry. Principle. Progress. Prophecy. Prudence. Reasoning. Relation. What are we going to read about? Animal. Eternity. History. Honor. Infinity. Let's read about infinity. Let's see how many pages that is. I don't know if I want to show more of the background or the bookshelves. It's right in the middle, maybe. Oh. That's pretty good. Infinity. Infinity. Okay. Infinity. Give me something to listen to while I program later. One, two, three, 4, 6, 7, 8. Pages. I was afraid it was gonna go on forever. Huh. Infinity. One of the persistent questions concerning infinity is whether we can know or comprehend it. Another is whether the infinite exists. And if so, to what kind of thing infinity belongs? It is not surprising therefore, that the discussion of infinity often borders on the unintelligible. The idea of infinity, like the idea of eternity, lacks the support of the imagination or of sensible experience. The fact that the infinite cannot be perceived or imagined seems sufficient to lead Hobbes and Berkeley to deny its reality. Whatsoever we imagine is finite, writes Hobbes. Therefore, there is no idea or conception of anything we call infinite. It's a word that shouldn't exist. That's what they say. When we say anything is infinite, we signify only that we are not able to conceive the ends and bounds of the thing named, having no conception of the thing, but of our own inability. On similar grounds, Berkeley rejects the possibility of infinite division. I cannot perceive innumerable parts in any infinite extension. He writes, it is certain that they are not contained in it, but it is evident that I cannot distinguish innumerable parts in any particular line, surface, or solid, which I either perceive by sense or figure to myself in my mind. Wherefore, I conclude that they are not contained in it. But for most of the great writers on the subject, the impossibility of representing infinity and eternity to the imagination does not render them inconceivable or meaningless. Yet it does account for the difficulty of grasping their meaning, a difficulty further increased by the fact that, whatever their meaning, infinity and eternity are indefinable. To define the infinite would be to limit, even in thought, the unlimited. The notion of infinity involves greater perplexities than that of eternity. The meaning of eternity is weighted with the mystery of God, the world, and time. All these affect the conception of infinity. But for the infinite, there are also the mysteries of number and of space, of matter and motion. In the sphere of quantity, or of things subject to quantity, infinity is itself the source of mystery, or at least the root of difficulty in analysis. It is the central term in the discussion of the continuous and the indivisible, the nature of series and of limits. As indicated in the chapter on eternity, that idea, in each of its applications, seems to have one or the other of two meanings. One, the meaning in which it signifies infinite time, time without beginning or end, and two, the meaning in which it signifies the timelessness or immutability of being. Both meanings are negative so far as our understanding is concerned. But what is signified by the second is in itself something positive, at least in the opinion of those who think that to be exempt from change entails having every perfection or being lacking in nothing. This split in meaning also occurs in the idea of infinity. As applied to being, the term infinite signifies something positive, even though our understanding of what is signified remains negative, or at best analogical. An infinite being is one which lacks no attribute that can belong to a being. This is the positive condition of absolute perfection. The infinite here still means the unlimited, but that which is unlimited in being has no defect. To lack deficiencies is to be perfect. Oh, you like the new background? What background? This is my home. What do you mean? Uh, be perfect. It is in this sense that Spinoza defines God as being absolutely infinite. That is to say, substance consisting of infinite attributes, each one of which expresses eternal and infinite essence. Like Spinoza, Aquinas maintains that besides God, nothing can be infinite, but he distinguishes the absolute or positive sense in which God alone is infinite from the sense of the word in which it can be said that things other than God can be relatively infinite, but not absolutely infinite. This other meaning, according to Aquinas, is not only relative, but negative, for it connotes something imperfect. It signifies indeterminacy or lack of perfection in being. What Aquinas calls the relative or potential infinite, he attributes to matter and to quantities, to bodies, to the magnitudes of space and time, and to number. This sense of infinite corresponds to that meaning of eternal, according to which time consists of an endless series of moments, each having a predecessor and a successor, no matter how far one counts them back into the past or ahead into the future. But in the field of quantities, other than time, the meaning of infinite and eternal part company. There is, of course, some parallelism between infinite space and infinite time, insofar as an infinite extension is one which does not begin at any point or end at any. But the consideration of space and number leads to an aspect of infinity which has no parallel in the consideration of eternity. In sizes or numbers, Pascal writes, nature has set before man two marvelous infinities. For from the fact that they can always be increased, it follows absolutely that they can always be decreased. If we can multiply a number up to 100,000 times, say, we can also take 100,000 part, a 100,000th part of it, by dividing it by the same number we multiply it with. And thus, every term of increase will become a term of division by changing the integer into a fraction. So that infinite increase includes necessarily infinite division. As endless addition produces the infinitely large, so endless division produces, as endless addition produces the infinitely large, so endless division produces the infinitesimal or infinitely small. A trillion is a finite number because the addition of a single unit increases a larger number. The fact that the addition of another unit produces a different number indicates that a trillion has a determinate size, which is the same as saying it is a finite number. An infinite number cannot be increased by addition, for it is constituted, in thought at least, as a number larger than the sum of any two finite numbers, which is another way of saying that it is approached by carrying on the process of addition endlessly. The size of an infinite number is therefore indeterminate. Infinite. I think we all remember the first time we wrapped our heads around the idea of infinity as children. When you were trying to one-up your buddy by naming a bigger number. And then he says infinity, and you're like, what the hell is that? Let me describe it. It goes on forever. What Galileo points out about two infinite quantities seems to hold for an infinite and a finite quantity. He asks us to consider the totality of all integers, which is infinite, and the totality of their squares, which is also infinite. On the one hand, there appears to be as many squares as there are integers. On the other hand, the totality of integers includes all the squares, precisely because the number of squares is not less than the totality of all numbers, nor the latter greater than the former. Galileo insists that the attributes equal, greater, and less are not applicable to infinity, but only to finite quantities, nor does the sense in which one finite quantity can be greater or less than another. That is, by a determinate difference between them, apply in the comparison of a finite and an infinite quantity. The latter, being indeterminately large, is indeterminately larger than any finite quantity. These remarks apply to the infinitely small as well. The infinitesimal is immeasurably small, or indeterminately less than any finite fraction, no matter how small, because its own size is indeterminate. The finite fraction itself, a product of division, can be divided again, but if an infinitesimal quantity were capable of further division, it would permit a smaller, and since that smaller quantity would be a determinate fraction of itself, the infinitesimal would have to be determinate in size. Since that is not so, the infinitesimal must be conceived as the indivisible, or as the limit approached by carrying on division endlessly. Because the hypothesis of indivisibles seems somewhat harsh, Newton proposes an analysis in the terms of what he calls nascent and evanescent quantities, or quantities just beginning to be more than nothing, or just at the point at which they vanish into nothing. Proposes an analysis of what he calls nascent, evanescent quantities. Just beginning to be more than nothing, or just at the point in which they vanish into nothing. As there is a limit which the velocity at the end of a motion may attain, but not exceed, there is a like limit in all quantities and proportions that begin or cease to be. Newton warns his reader, therefore, that if he should happen to mention quantities at least, or evanescent, or ultimate, the reader is not to suppose that quantities of any determinate magnitude are meant, but such as are conceived to be always diminished without end. Later, speaking of quantities which are variable and indeterminate, and increasing or decreasing, as it were, by continual motion or flux, he adds, take care not to look upon finite quantities as such. The method of fluxions provides an infinitesimal calculus on the hypothesis of limits rather than of indivisibles. Through all these conceptions of infinity, metaphysical, mathematical, and physical, run the paired notions of the unlimited end of limits approached but not attained. The finite is neither unlimited, nor does it insensibly approach a limit. There are also the opposite notions of the perfect and the indeterminate. The finite is neither, for it is determinate without being a totality or complete. Though they have a common thread of meaning, and though each raises similar difficulties for the understanding, the conception of infinity and being or power, and the conception of infinite or infinitesimal quantity require separate consideration. The same question may be asked of each. Questions about the existence of the infinite and about our knowledge of it, but the same answers will not be given in each case. There are those who deny the existence of an actual infinite body or an actually infinite number, yet affirm the infinite existence of God. There are those who declare the infinity of matter to be intrinsically unintelligible, but maintain that God, who is infinite, is intrinsically the most intelligible object. They add, of course, that the infinite being of God cannot be comprehended by our finite intellects. On each of these points, an opposite view has been taken, but the dispute concerning the infinity of God involves issues other than those which occur in the controversy over the infinite, the visibility of matter, or the infinity of space and time. It seems advisable, therefore, to deal separately with the problems of infinity as they arise with respect to different objects or occur in different subject matters. The conception of God, in the words of Anselm, as being, quote, than which is a greater cannot be conceived, or in the words of Kant, as an ens realismum, a most real being, expresses the plenitude of the divine nature and existence. The medieval thesis defended by Descartes that God's essence and existence are identical implies that neither is contracted or determined by the other. The still earlier notion of Aristotle, repeated by Aquinas, that God is pure actuality, carries with it the attributes of completeness or perfection, which are the positive aspects of immutability or incapacity for change. Spinoza's definition of substance as that which exists not only in itself, but through itself and by its very nature, entails the autonomy or utter independence of the divine being. These are so many different ways of stating that God is an infinite being. Both Aquinas and Spinoza make infinity the basis for proving that there can be only one God. When Spinoza argues that a plurality of substances possessing the same nature is absurd, he has in mind the identification of infinite substance with God. If many gods existed, Aquinas writes, they would necessarily differ from each other. Something would therefore belong to one, which did not belong to another. And if this were a privation, one of them would not be absolutely perfect. But if it were a perfection, one of them would be without it. So it is impossible for many gods to exist. That is, of course, if infinity is a property of the divine nature. Aquinas makes this condition clear when he goes on to say that the ancient philosophers, constrained as it were by the truth, when they asserted an infinite principle, asserted likewise that there was only one such principle. Uh, there was only one such principle. But while it is impossible for there to be two infinities of being, it is not impossible for there to be two or more infinite quantities. One explanation of the difference seems to be the actuality or existence of an infinite being, in contrast to the conceptual character of the infinite objects of mathematics, which are sometimes called potential infinities because they are conceived as in an endless process of becoming, or as approaching a limit that is never reached. When the physical existence of infinite quantities is asserted, as for example a universe of infinite extent or an infinite number of atoms, the uniqueness of these actual totalities seems to follow. Two infinite worlds cannot coexist, though the one can be infinite in several distinct respects, in space or duration, or in the number of its constituents, even as the infinity of God, according to Spinoza, involves infinite attributes, each one of which expresses eternal and infinite essence. Spinoza's argument against two actual infinities seems to find confirmation in the position taken by Aquinas that God's omnipotence does not include the power to create an infinite world. God's infinity, as we have already noted, follows from the identity of God's essence and existence. Since a created being has existence added to its essence, Aquinas asserts that it is against the nature of a created thing to be absolutely infinite. Therefore, he continues, as God, although he has infinite power, cannot make a thing to be not made, for this would imply that two contradictories are true at the same time, so likewise he cannot make anything to be absolutely infinite. On this view, an infinite world cannot coexist with an infinite God if, in their separate existence, one is dependent on the other, as creature upon creator. The infinity of the world, or of nature, in Spinoza's conception, is not separate from the infinity of God, but consists in the infinity of two of God's attributes, extension and thought. In our time, there has arisen the conception of a finite God, a God who, while the most perfect being, yet is not without capacity for growth or change, a God who is eternal without being immutable. This conception, which in the light of traditional theology, appears to be as self-contradictory as round square, has arisen in response to the difficulties certain critics have found in the traditional doctrine of an infinite being. They point to the difficulty of understanding how finite beings can exist separate from, yet in addition to, an infinite being. They also cite difficulties in the notions of infinite knowledge, infinite power, and infinite goodness. The infinity of the divine omniscience extends to the possible as well as to the actual, but the possible includes things which are incompatible with one another. things which, in the language of Leibniz, are not compossible. The incompossible would thus seem to be embraced in the infinite scope of divine thought or knowledge. In the view of one theologian, Nicholas of Cusa, the mystery of God's infinity is best expressed by affirming that in God all contradictions are somehow reconciled. The infinity of God's power, or the divine omnipotence, also raises questions about the possible and the impossible. Is nothing impossible to God, or must it be said that there are certain things which not even God can do, such as reverse the order of time, or create a world which shall be as infinite and perfect as himself? In the assertion that God cannot do the impossible, Aquinas sees no limitation on God's power. It's interesting how Aquinas seems to deduce God's existence from his own reason. At least that's how he talks. It's like, oh, it wouldn't make sense if God didn't exist. Because X, Y, Z. And not just his existence, but his nature. Everything he does, everything that makes him God. In the assertion that God cannot do the impossible, Aquinas sees no limitation on God's power. The impossible, he writes, does not come under the divine omnipotence, not because of any defect in the power of God, but because it has not the nature of a feasible or possible thing. For this reason, he claims, it is better to say that such things cannot be done than that God cannot do them. The inability to do the undoable constitutes no violation of infinite power, even as the lack of nothing does not deprive infinite being of anything. The infinite goodness of God is sometimes set against the fact of evil, or the existence of imperfections in the created world. This aspect of the problem of evil, like that which concerns man's freedom to obey or disobey the divine will, cannot be separated from the fundamental mystery of God's infinity, in power and knowledge as well as in goodness. The problem is concerned in the chapter on good and evil. The point there mentioned, that evil is essentially non-being, or deprivation of being, leads to one solution of the problem. It accepts the finitude, and consequently the imperfection of creatures as a necessary consequence of God's infinity. The best of all possible worlds cannot be infinitely good. To man alone, among all admittedly finite things, has infinity been attributed, and even made a distinctive mark of his nature. Does this introduce a new meaning of infinity, neither quantitative nor divine? It has seldom, if ever, been questioned that man is finite in being and power. The limits of power The limits of human capacity for knowledge or achievement are a perennial theme in man's study of man. Yet it is precisely with regard to capacity that certain writers have intimated man's infinity. Pascal, for example, finds the apparent contradictions in human nature intelligible only when man is understood as yearning for or impelled toward the infinite. We burn with desire, he says, to find solid ground and an ultimate, sure foundation whereon to build a tower reaching to the infinite. But our whole groundwork cracks, and the earth opens to abysses. In this fact lies both the grandeur and the misery of man. He aspires to the infinite, yet he is a finite being, dissatisfied with his own finite and frustrated by it. That's what I've said. We have minds like gods, but powers, but we're powerless. It's like we were designed to have infinite power just like God, but we don't. It would seem. It's like a curse to be human. It is sometimes said that the touch of infinity in man, with the suggestion that it is a touch of madness, consists in his wanting to be God. Those who regard such desire as abnormal or perverse interpret it as a misdirection of man's natural desire to know God face to face and to be filled with the love of God in the divine presence. But according to the theory of natural desire, the tendency of each nature is somehow proportionate to its capacity. If man's restless search for knowledge and happiness can be quieted only by the possession of the infinite truth and goodness which is God, then man's intellect and will must somehow be as infinite in nature as they are in tendency. Yet that is not an unqualified infinity, for the same theologians who teach that man naturally seeks God also hold that man's finite intellect cannot comprehend the infinite being of God, as God knows himself. Nor do they think that man's capacity for knowing and loving God can be fulfilled except to the beatific vision, which is a supernatural gift rather than a natural achievement. These and related matters are discussed in the chapters on desire and knowledge. The great books speak of other objects than God as objects of man's infinite desire. The appetite for money, for pleasure, for power seems to be an infinite craving, which no finite quantity of these goods ever satisfies. Two comments are made upon this fact, which is so amply evidenced in the human record. One is that man's infinite lust for worldly goods expresses, even as it conceals, his natural desire for a truly infinite good. The other is that these worldly goods are seductive objects precisely because they are infinite. Here the word infinite is used, not in the sense which signifies perfection, but in the quantitative sense, which has the meaning of indetermination. Plato's division in the philebus of goods into the finite and the infinite separates measured and definite goods from those which need some limitation in quantity. Socrates exemplifies the distinction by reference to the fact that into the hotter and the colder there enters a more or a less, and since there is never any end of them, they must also be infinite. In contrast, when definite quantity is once admitted, there can be no longer a hotter or a colder. Such things, he says, which do not admit of more or less, belong in the class of the limited or finite. Following the line of this example, Socrates later distinguishes between infinite and finite pleasures, or pleasures without limit, and those which have some intrinsic measure. Pleasures which are in excess, he says, have no measure, but those which are not in excess have measure. The great, the excessive, we shall be right in referring to the class of the infinite, and of the more and the less, and the others we shall refer to the class which has measure. The fact that the goodness of wealth or of certain pleasures is indeterminate or indefinite makes it necessary to determine or measure the amount of wealth it is good to possess, or the quantity of such pleasure it is good to enjoy. As in the case of desire, so the human intellect is also said to be infinite in the sense of reaching to an indefinite quantity. On the theory which he holds that the intellect knows by means of universal concepts, Aquinas attributes to the human mind an infinite power, for it apprehends the universal, which can extend itself to an infinitude of singular things. Each universal signifies what is common to an indefinitely large class of particular instances. There is still another sense in which the intellect is said to be infinite, namely, by reason of its having the potentiality to apprehend all knowable things. But this is a relative infinity, as is the corresponding infinity of prime matters, which is conceived as the potentiality for taking on all forms. In both cases, the infinite is qualified by a restriction on the kind of things knowable to the intellect and the type of forms receivable in matter. The infinity of prime matter, matter totally devoid of form, is also comparable to the infinity of God, in a contrast of extreme opposites. The absolute indeterminacy of pure potentiality on the one hand, the absolute perfection of pure actuality on the other. The infinity of matter involves different considerations when the problem concerns not prime matter, but material things, bodies. The question is twofold. Can there be a body of infinite magnitude? Is there an infinite number of bodies? To both questions, Aristotle gives the negative answer. while Spinoza seems to answer the first, and Lucretius the second, affirmatively. Spinoza's affirmation may be qualified. Well, I think if you're trying to determine if there is an infinite amount of is, you have to determine what is. Because maybe everything we think that exists doesn't really exist. And so it's not infinite because it doesn't exist in the first place. How about that? Bet that blows your mind. Spinoza's affirmation may be qualified, of course, by his conception of infinite body as an attribute of God, but there is no qualification on Lucretius's assertion that the first beginnings of things are infinite, unless it is his statement that the first beginnings of things have different shapes, but the number of shapes is finite. It is only the number of atoms which is infinite, not their variety. Aristotle presents many arguments against the existence of an infinite body or an infinite number of things, all of which ultimately rest on the distinction between an actual and potential infinite. It is not that infinity in magnitude or multitude is impossible, for he affirms the infinity of time, and he insists upon the infinite divisibility of matter, but rather that if an infinite body existed, its infinity would have to be actual. Its actuality would necessarily involve certain determinations, especially those of dimension and place, which would be inconsistent with the indeterminacy of the infinite. Similarly, a multitude of coexisting things, unlike the moments of time which do not coexist, cannot be infinite, because their coexistence implies that they can be actually numbered, whereas their infinity implies that they are numberless. The potential infinite, Aristotle writes, exhibits itself in different ways, in time, in the generations of man, and in the division of magnitudes. For generally, he says, the infinite has this mode of existence. One thing is always being taken after another, and each thing that is taken is always finite, but always different. When this takes place in the division of spatial magnitudes, what is taken persists, while in the succession of times and of men, it takes place by the passing away of these in such a way that the source of supply never gives out. The opposition between Lucretius and Aristotle with regard to the divisibility of matter is discussed in the chapter on element. The notions of infinity and continuity are differently employed on the two sides of the argument, where Aristotle makes the continuity of matter the condition of its infinite divisibility. Lucretius makes the atom's continuity its solidity or lack of void the cause of its indivisibility, where Aristotle asserts that at any moment there can be only a finite number of particles in the world, because the partition of matter cannot be infinitely carried out, short of infinite time. Lucretius, on the contrary, thinks that the division of matter into smaller and smaller parts finds an end in the atomic particles, and yet he also asserts an infinite number of atoms. To contain an infinite number of atoms, an infinite space is required. According to Lucretius, this presents no greater difficulty for him than an infinite time. Aristotle, on the other hand, differentiates between space and time with respect to infinity. Time can be potentially infinite by way of addition, because each part that is taken passes in succession out of existence. But though space may be infinitely divisible, it cannot be infinitely extended, for all its parts, unlike those of time, must coexist. It would therefore have to be an actually, rather than a potentially, infinite quantity, and this, Aristotle thinks, is impossible. Seems to me like infinite existence is just as possible as any existence. It's probably not the case that everything's just out there infinitely existing of its own accord. I think probably if it wasn't continuously being created by God's word, then it wouldn't exist. Of course, the idea of something not existing is probably inconceivable to a human mind. It's inconceivable that nothing would exist. Because in the very act of imagining nothingness, you've created something. Crap, lost my place. Uh, to contain an infinite number of atoms, an infinite space is required, according to Lucretius. This presents no greater difficulty for him than an infinite time. Aristotle, on the other hand, differentiates between space and time with respect to infinity. Time can be potentially infinite by way of addition, because each part that is taken passes in succession out of existence. But though space may be infinitely divisible, it cannot be infinitely extended, for all its parts, unlike those of time, must coexist. It would therefore have to be an actually, rather than a potentially, infinite quantity, and this Aristotle thinks is impossible. These and other conflicting views concerning the infinity of space and time appear in Kant's statement of the first cosmological antinomy. His intention is not to resolve the issues, but to show that they cannot be resolved by proof or argument. To do this, Kant sets up what seems to him to be equally strong or equally inconclusive arguments for and against the infinity of space and time. Suppose it be granted, Kant argues, on the one hand, that the world has no beginning in time, then it would follow that up to every given moment in time, an eternity must have elapsed, and therewith passed away an infinite series of successive conditions or states of things in the world. But since the infinity of a series consists in the fact that it can never be completed by means of a successive synthesis, it also follows that an infinite series already elapsed is impossible, and that consequently a beginning of the world is a necessary condition of its existence. On the other hand, Kant argues with what he thinks is equal force, let it be granted that the world has a beginning. A beginning, he explains, is an existence which is preceded by a time in which the thing does not exist. Then, Kant continues, on the above supposition, it follows that there must have been a time in which the world did not exist. That is, a void time. But in a void time, the origination of a thing is impossible, because no part of any such time contains a distinctive condition of being in preference to that of non-being. Consequently, many series of things may have a beginning in the world, but the world itself cannot have a beginning, and is, therefore, in relation to past time, infinite. With regard to the infinity or finitude of space, Kant proceeds similarly. If we suppose space to be infinite, then the world must be an infinite given total of coexistent things. But in order to cogitate the world, which fills all spaces as a whole, the successive synthesis of the parts of an infinite world must be looked upon as completed. That is to say, an infinite time must be regarded as having elapsed in the enumeration of all coexisting things. This, Kant argues, is impossible, and therefore an infinite aggregate of actual things cannot be considered as a given whole. Hence it follows that the world is, as regards extension in space, not infinite, but enclosed in limits. Yeah, I mean, it's infinite until you've imagined something, until you've imagined it in a limited form. It's infinite in terms of its potentiality. With regard to the infinity or finitude, coexistent things. If, however, we suppose that the world is finite and limited in space, it follows, according to Kant, that it must exist in a void space which is not limited. We should therefore meet not only with a relation of things in space, but also a relation of things to space. But the relation of the world to a void space is merely a relation to no object. In such a relation, and consequently the limitation of the world by void space is nothing. It follows, therefore, Kant concludes that the world as regards to space is not limited, that is, it is infinite in regard to extension. The way in which these opposite arguments nullify each other reveals more than our inability to prove or disprove the infinity of space and time. It shows, in Kant's theory of human knowledge, that we are not entitled to make any assertion at all respecting the whole object of experience, the world of sense. One other problem of infinity in the sphere of physics receives its initial formulation in one of the great books, in the part of the dialogues concerning the two new sciences, where Galileo discusses the uniform acceleration of a freely falling body, the body which is said to accumulate equal increments of velocity in equal intervals of time, is also said to start from infinite slowness, i.e. from rest. One of the persons in the dialogue challenges this, saying that as the instant of starting is more and more nearly approached, the body moves so slowly that if it kept on moving at this rate, it would not traverse a mile in an hour, or in a day, or in a year, or in 1,000 years. Indeed, it would not traverse a span in an even greater time, a phenomenon which baffles the imagination, while our senses show us that a heavy falling body suddenly acquires great speed. What our senses seem to show us is corrected by an experiment which refines the observation. But this still leaves a purely analytical question against the statement that the velocity can be increased or diminished without limit. Simplicio points out in the dialogue that if the number of degrees of greater and greater slowness is limitless, they will never be exhausted, and therefore the body will never come to rest when it is slowing down, or be able to start to move when it is at rest. This would happen, Salviati answers, if the moving body were to maintain its speed for any length of time at each degree of velocity, but it merely passes each point without delaying more than an instant, and since each time interval, however small, may be divided into an infinite number of instants, these will always be sufficient to correspond to the infinite degrees of diminished velocity. What background? This is my house. This is where I live. I don't know what you're talking about. The problem of the diminished velocity, the problem of the infinitesimal velocity provides another illustration of the difference between infinity in the physical and the mathematical orders. Unlike parallel lines in Euclidean geometry, which are lines that remain equidistant from one another when both are prolonged to infinity, an asymptote is a straight line which a curved line continuously approaches, but never meets, even when both are infinitely extended. The distance between the curve and its asymptote diminishes to smaller and smaller intervals, but no matter how small they become, the two lines never coincide. The diminishing intervals between the curve and its asymptote are like the diminishing degrees of velocity in a body starting from or coming to rest. But we know that the body does begin or cease to move, and so there is the mysterious jumping of the gap between rest and motion in the physical order, whereas in the mathematical order, the limiting point can be forever approached and never reached. I don't know what you mean by that, Mortimer. One other problem of infinity in the sphere of physics receives its initial formulation in one of the great books, in the part of the Dialogues Concerning the Two New Sciences, where Galileo discusses the uniform acceleration of a freely... Did I already read all that? Yes, I did. There is one other context in which infinity is discussed in the great books. The logicians treat certain terms and judgments as infinite. Aristotle, for example, regards the negative term, such as not man or not white, as indefinite. The indefiniteness of its signification may be seen when such terms are used as subjects of discourse. What is being talked about? The answer must be given, in part at least, in positive terms. Not man represents the whole universe, leaving man out, or the totality of everything except man. Thus, in its positive signification, the negative term has a kind of infinity, the infinite totality of subjects diminished by one, the one that is negated. In his classification of judgments, Kant makes a threefold division of judgments according to quality: the affirmative, the negative, and the infinite. The infinite judgment involves a negative in its construction, but when that negative is given an affirmative interpretation, the infinite significance of the proposition becomes apparent. An example will make this clear. The proposition, "This animal is not white," is negative. It simply denies a certain quality of a certain thing. But the proposition, "This animal is not white," is infinite, for it affirms the negated term, and so places the subject in the infinite class, or totality, which includes everything except white things. The position of the hyphen serves to indicate whether the statement shall be construed negatively or affirmatively, and infinitely. The problems of definition and demonstration are differently solved by the logicians according to the way in which they propose to avoid infinite regressions. In analysis or reasoning, there would be no end to the process of defining if every term had to be defined before it could be used in the definition of another term. There would be no beginning to the process of proof if, before a proposition could be used as a premise to demonstrate some conclusion, it had itself to be demonstrated as a conclusion from prior premises. In his essay on geometrical demonstration, Pascal refers to the proposal of a plan for defining and proving everything. Certainly this method would be beautiful, he says, but it is absolutely impossible, for it is evident that the first terms we wished to define would presuppose others for their explication, and that similarly the first propositions we wished to prove would suppose others that preceded them, and it is thus clear we should never arrive at the first propositions. The chapter on definition considers the character and choice of the indefinable terms, by which an infinite regression is avoided in the elucidation of meanings. The chapters on induction and principle consider the various sorts of primary propositions, axioms, postulates, assumptions, by which a similar regression is avoided in the process of proof. The chapter on cause deals with the problem of an infinite regression in causes and effects. Here it is appropriate to consider the difference between an infinite series of reasons and an infinite series of causes. To the extent that both are truly series, the succession of one thing after another, neither seems to be impossible given infinite time. Those who deny the possibility of an infinite number of causes distinguish between essential and accidental causes, that is, between causes which must coexist with their effects and causes which can precede their effects, and cease to be before their effects occur. If there were an infinite time, there would be an infinite series of accidental causes, but it may be questioned whether even granted an infinite time, the relation between the premises and conclusion of reasoning permits an infinite regression. If the truth of a conclusion cannot be known until the truth of its premises is known, then the pursuit of truth may be vitiated by a search ad infinitum. There you have it. Let's cross infinity off the list, shall we? CDPHI. God, please don't let me lose my hair. It's pretty thick. It's pretty big, bald, parting right there. Just need most of it. I need all of it, just most of it. Okay. This right here. Infinity crossed off the list. What do I think about infinity? Well, I think I'm able to grasp it as much as I'm able to grasp non-infinity. I don't know why the world exists. Whether it exists in a limited capacity or not. I mean, the idea of nothingness is as bizarre to me as the idea of being. Bizarre is not a good word. It says it's weird that we have terms for ideas that pertain to God and not man. And that's why sometimes I think all this philosophizing and, you know, uh, zip on these pants does not still up. It's a huge problem. It's almost like a vice to indulge so much in abstract thought when the truth of reality is in the world. Not in books and in your head. I think you learn things from experience that these guys would call divine revelation. It's not divine revelation to just go out and be a human being in the world. And I guess it is, but not in some supernatural sense. That's what Christ such an interesting character in history to me. I mean, he would refute everyone that he argued with, I guess, but and people would try to argue with him and catch him in some sort of erroneous self contradiction or something. He would say, "Why are you trying to make me look stupid?" You know? And then he would just call them like wicked snakes in the grass and tell them to get lost. It's not about being able to talk your way out of any argument. It's more important to live life than it is to understand it, I think. That's what the Pharisees didn't understand. And through living life, you understand it better than if you had just contemplated it and examined it, I think. But some things you can only learn through experience. The experience changes you. It's not the proof of something. Proof for somebody might mean one thing, and for someone and have no meaning for somebody else. But an experience will change everybody who witnesses it.